Well, yesterday's Republican primary had what has become the standard vote split of 63% to 33%. But this time, Nikki Haley got the 63% and Donald Trump got the 33%. It was in the smallest Republican primary so far. It was in Washington, D.C., where in a city of 700,000 people, exactly 676 of them voted for Donald Trump. The reason that tiny vote is significant is that Donald Trump's jury pool for Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's case against Donald Trump for alleged crimes leading up to and on January 6th will be taken. That jury pool will be taken from those 700,000 people who spent yesterday not voting for Donald Trump. The odds of one of the 676 Republicans who did vote for Donald Trump in Washington, D.C. yesterday ending up on his jury there are worse than your odds with any lottery ticket you could buy anywhere. The most important Washington, D.C. voters for Donald Trump, though, are, of course, the 9 voters on the United States Supreme Court. And today, all 9 of them agreed that Donald Trump, who 3 of the justices called an oath-breaking insurrectionist, cannot be barred from presidential ballots by individual states on the basis of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, as most of you know by now, bars anyone who took an oath of office and then engaged in insurrection from ever holding office again. Donald Trump's lawyers lost on several arguments that they presented to the court. They argued that the presidency is not an office. The Supreme Court ignored that argument. The Trump lawyers argued that the president is not an officer of the government. The Supreme Court ignored that argument. And most importantly, the Trump lawyers argued that Donald Trump did not engage in insurrection and that the attack on the Capitol was not an insurrection. The Supreme Court ignored that argument and left standing the finding by the Colorado Supreme Court that Donald Trump did indeed engage in insurrection. The Supreme Court's opinion simply said that the individual states are not allowed to enforce the provisions of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against candidates for federal office. The opinion said that the state of Colorado could enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against candidates seeking state and local offices in Colorado. The 5 Republican men on the Supreme Court, 2 of whom were appointed by Donald Trump, extended their majority opinion far beyond what the 9 justices were willing to agree on in the essential ruling by indicating that even the federal enforcement of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment would require the Congress to pass implementing legislation. The 3 justices of the Supreme Court appointed by President Obama and President Biden wrote a separate opinion of only 6 pages where they referred to Donald Trump as an oath-breaking insurrectionist 4 times and said, quote, legislation of any kind, however, is not required, and that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is self-executing, meaning that it does not depend on implementing legislation. The 3 concurring justices, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, said, quote, Section 3 provides that when an oath-breaking insurrectionist is disqualified, Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each House, remove such disability. It is hard to understand why the Constitution would require a congressional supermajority to remove a disqualification if a simple majority could nullify Section 3's operation by repealing or declining to pass implementing legislation. It's worse than they know. It would not take a simple majority to decline to pass implementing legislation, to vote against implementing legislation. It would only take 41 out of 100 senators to block implementing legislation, which, according to the procedural rules of the United States Senate, requires a 60-vote majority threshold to pass. So, if a group of 59 senators agreed on implementing legislation tomorrow for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, it could not become law. It could be blocked by 41 senators who support an oath-breaking insurrection and want to see an oath-breaking insurrectionist become president again. There are now 49 Republican senators, and only one of them, the retiring Mitt Romney, has said he is opposed to the oath-breaking insurrectionist Donald Trump becoming president again. That leaves 48 Republican senators who would refuse to ever approve any implementing legislation for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. The last judge appointed to the court by Donald Trump, Amy Coney Barrett, wrote her own one-paragraph concurring opinion saying simply, "I agree that states lack the power to enforce Section 3 against presidential candidates. That principle is sufficient to resolve this case, and I would decide no more than that." Justice Barrett then added a second paragraph to her one-page concurrence that did not have a single word of jurisprudence in it. It was a political speech aimed at the three other justices who agreed with her that the majority of 5 on the Supreme Court went too far in their opinion. Justice Barrett, though she apparently agrees with those 3 justices, decided for political purposes that their language was too harsh. And that is a political choice, not a jurisprudential choice. In a political statement, unlike any that I've ever seen in a Supreme Court opinion, Justice Barrett wrote, "In my judgment, this is not the time to amplify disagreement with stridency." In her view, no doubt, stridency means using phrases like an oath-breaking insurrectionist to describe Donald Trump. Justice Barrett continued, "The court has settled a politically charged issue in the volatile season of a presidential election, particularly in this circumstances. Writings on the court should turn the national temperature down, not up. For present purposes, our differences are far less important than our unanimity. All 9 justices agree on the outcome of this case. That is the message Americans should take home." Written not like a Supreme Court justice, but like a political speechwriter. The message Americans should take home. Justice Sotomayor, Justice Kagan, and Justice Jackson highlighted the wild inconsistency of the Roberts Court by quoting Chief Justice Roberts himself, who wrote this when he joined the majority opinion in overturning Roe versus Wade. Quote, "If it is not necessary to decide more to dispose of a case, then it is necessary not to decide more." The 3 justices then said, "That fundamental principle of judicial restraint is practically as old as our republic. Yet, the court continues on to resolve questions not before us. In a sensitive case, crying out for judicial restraint, it abandons that course. Today, the majority goes beyond the necessities of this case to limit how Section 3 can bar an oath-breaking insurrectionist from becoming president. Although we agree that Colorado cannot enforce Section 3, we protest the majority's effort to use this case to define the limits of federal enforcement of that provision, because we would decide only the issue before us. We concur only in the judgment." And today, at the Florida club, where Donald Trump cannot afford to live without charging other people money to use his home, the oath-breaking insurrectionist thanked the Supreme Court for their opinion and then spent most of his time asking the court for another favor, to grant him total immunity for any form of criminal prosecution for crimes that he may have committed while he was president. In fact, most of his statement was begging for that criminal immunity. He did say this about today's opinion.
Frankly, they worked very quickly on something that will be spoken about 100 years from now and 200 years from now. Extremely important.
Well, he's absolutely right about that. It will be spoken of in history classrooms 100 years from now and 200 years from now, where he will, if the country remains lucky for the next couple of centuries, be identified as the only former president in history who was once blocked from presidential ballots by states invoking Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. And those history classes will all note that the Supreme Court opinion that allowed him access to the ballot repeatedly referred to him as an oath-breaking insurrectionist. Congressman Rochester, what we just heard from the vice president sounds like something we're going to repeatedly be hearing during this presidential campaign. You're a co-chair of the Biden-Harris campaign, and this issue of in vitro fertilization seems to have helped frame what Republicans are trying to do with personal freedoms that we all thought we were going to be able to enjoy.
Well, first of all, Lawrence, it's good to be back with you, and especially talking about something as important as our freedoms. I have to say, Vice President Harris gave a powerful speech and really drawing that analogy between protecting and defending our right to vote, all the way to the ability to do with our bodies as we choose. It's one of the reasons why I'm running for the Senate, is to stand up and fight for these freedoms. And, you know, for me, it's also personal. I have never really talked about this before, but my son and my daughter-in-law had their child through IVF. And so this is my granddaughter, Lennox. Lennox was born through IVF. And there are so many families out there who, as she said, this is a dream. And so to have, on the one hand, again, extremists who are trying to tell you when you can and cannot have a child, and then on the other hand, prevent those who want to have a child, the thing that's in common is control over women's bodies. And so as we look to this election, people really have to think about what Republicans say versus what they do. You can say that you support different things, but we saw the Dobbs decision. You can say you support IVF, but senators just voted against Senator Tammy Duckworth's bill to protect IVF. And as you look at this slippery slope, what's next? Birth control. And so to me, this is a moment for us to say, are we going to go with folks who are taking away our freedoms, or are we going to defend them, especially as John Lewis did on that Edmund Pettus Bridge?
Could you hold up that picture of that miracle baby again, your granddaughter? Because I think for people who aren't familiar with the process of IVF and how difficult it can be for some couples get lucky and go through the process once. Not an easy process, no matter how often you go through it. Some couples have to go through that process several times over a number of years in order to get to that wonderful point where a grandmother like you can hold up that picture. What does it mean for families and couples who are in the middle of the process? They're in the middle of the process in Alabama, and the government says to them, you can't do this, not for another day.
I mean, first of all, my son and my daughter-in-law, they actually documented their process on social media to help, you know, other couples who were going through it. And as you said, actually, Christmas 2 years ago, I had a miscarriage and was able to try again, and Lennox was born. And so she's a rainbow baby. She just celebrated her first birthday. And to those families out there, the thought of, and not just the families, but the folks who are working in the fertility clinics, the folks who might have to transport, embryos. This puts a fear on them that should not be. It should not be. And so, again, for those of us who have the ability to protect and codify these rights, that's what we've got to do. That's, again, why I'm running for the Senate, because this is about our fundamental freedoms, all the way from the right to vote to the right to choose what you will do with your body. It's privacy. It's a medical decision. And I've said repeatedly, I say it all the time, there's no room in our wombs for politicians. There just isn't.
The Senate, as you know, is trying to pass a federal law that protects in vitro fertilization in all 50 states so that no couple in America ever has to worry that what happened in Alabama can happen to them. And Republicans are blocking it every single time. All they need, as you know, in that Senate procedure is to have one Republican stand up and block it, and that blocks the vote. But that one Republican is standing up for every single Republican in the United States Senate who opposes guaranteeing to couples the ability to do this.
Yeah. I mean, again, I always say, don't look at what somebody says, look at what they're doing. They have this opportunity now, and I'm hearing people say, oh, I support IVF. This is different. But the idea that we could have a national ban on abortion, the idea that we could have these kind of limits and fear for families that are trying to go through IVF, and then potentially what happens with birth control. Again, this is one of the reasons why it's important to have representation as well in the Senate that is diverse and reflects the experiences, the lived experiences of women across this country. It's one of the reasons why I'm fighting to go to the Senate. And for anybody who's interested in joining this movement, go to LisaBluntRochester.com. We need you.
Congresswoman Rochester, if you get to the Senate next year, I hope you can bring Lennox at least one day to meet Republican senators who are blocking a guarantee to all American families that they could have access to this procedure if they need it.
You know, I plan to bring Lennox should I make it. And I also hope someday to be able to pass the baton on to her and to the next generation. Again, this is why this moment is so pivotal in our country, because it truly is about our fundamental freedoms.
Well, you know, we've always seen those pictures of the families on the day when the new senators are taking their oaths of office. I think a lot of people tonight are going to be hoping to see Lennox on that Senate floor in that picture next year.
Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence.
Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester, thank you very much for sharing your family story with this very difficult process and what's happening in Alabama. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.